All right, Vermont history students, this is Unit 8. And first, I've received my first assessment paper, which was great. And so please, the other two of you, please send them in. If you're behind, which I won't penalize you for, if you do send me your first paper, don't send me the second one right at the same time. You might as well wait for me to get your comments right back to you. I'll do it immediately. And so then you can incorporate my comments into your next paper. That's what comments are for. Please do, by Monday, reply to the questions on the primary documents for town meeting number 4. So anyway, this unit, I tried to keep it simple and straightforward. It covers the years about 1906 to 1930, and it really only tells 2 stories and has 2 sections. And where it ends, you could look at it as telling the story of a woman, for instance, named Helena Dulles, who was 16 years old in 1929 when she was arrested for robbing people's houses in the town of Newfane. Newfane became a big tourist town. Helena and her younger siblings, who were very poor, used to break into people's houses, summer people's houses in the winter, and rob their stuff. And she got busted for this, along with her siblings. Her siblings were younger than 16, so they ended up in a school that was called the Brandon School for Feeble-Minded Children. But Helena was 16, so unfortunately she ended up at the nightmarish institution, the Waterbury State Hospital. And so here's like an example of a problem that downhillers have to deal with. By the 1920s, Vermont reaches like its peak of being like the ideal, perfect, beautiful, resplendent pastoral place, and as being sold as such. But of course it has problems. It has child labor, and it has poverty, and it has also, you know, Native Americans who are nomadic, and all sorts of obviously problems. And the question is, do downhillers just paper over those problems, or do they actually go about trying to fix them and make it so that Vermont, as a real, matches the ideal that they're describing it as? Now, in the unit folder, I gave you a couple primary documents. I gave you the Lure of Vermont Silent Places, just as an example of the sort of degree to which downhillers were selling Vermont as being this totally perfect place. The story that sort of illustrates what I'm talking about in that first section is the story about how this guy Lyman Simpson Hayes, who was a retiree who settled in Bellows Falls, became very interested in the old Rockingham Meeting House, which had not been used for 50 years. Beautiful old building, but had totally fallen into disrepair. And what Hayes did was he started to fix it up, and the graveyard was in terrible condition, and out of the goodness of his heart, in order to help people who had come back to look for ancestors, he alphabetized the gravestones, which is a crazy thing to do, of course, but it's sort of like a metaphor for how downhillers are going to try to fix Vermont so that the real approximates the ideal, because they are selling it as a place of perfect balance. It's modern conveniences, but it's also tradition and ancient virtues. It has all the best advantages of modern life, and you become rich, and there's total fertile fields for entrepreneurial behavior, but also it runs according to traditional values. That's the idea. So they tried to sell it that way, and in the 1920s it reaches a peak of that, for a variety of reasons. It's a decade of enormous change. Mass culture explodes, and a lot of people look for the past for solutions to the present disorientation. Also because of Calvin Coolidge, who really worked his image as the guy who came from a humble rural background and achieved great things. So there's Vermont in the 1920s at this sort of apex of its allure as a place that's both backward yet forward. And so what happens is that there was a professor of zoology at UVM, whose name was Henry Perkins, who became very interested in the gene theory. And like a lot of people around the country, as I said, became very interested not just in positive eugenics, encouraging the right people to breed, but in negative eugenics, preventing the wrong kind of people from breeding, from having children. And as a result of this, what happened was that the state first had a very comprehensive study of the state, and a book was published called Rural Vermont in 1930 that recommended all sorts of things, like doing away with billboards and preserving the state's traditions and poetry and things like this. But among the things that it says is there's a section on the people, which is really fascistic, it's scary. Perkins wrote it, and it's all about trying to preserve the good stock and trying to get rid of the bad stock. It speaks about people like they're cattle. And it gets gene theory totally wrong. It says things like venereal disease or genetic imperfections. And ultimately it says we are now in the process of passing a law to provide for the sterilization of people. And so in the end, about 260 people in Vermont got sterilized, among them Helena Dulles. And when Nancy Gallagher, a friend of mine who wrote a book on this topic, tried to track Helena down, she had moved to Ohio, had married. She just died, unfortunately, before Nancy got to her. But Nancy spoke to a friend of hers who said, oh, Helena was wonderful, she was very smart, good at knitting and all this, but the big tragedy in her life was she couldn't have kids, and she didn't know why. They didn't even tell her that they'd sterilized her. And so that's the model, the way you want to think about it perhaps, is are downhillers going to actually go about fixing the problems in Vermont? Or are they going to simply try to, try to have good, honest, positive solutions? Like something like child labor. Are they going to actually make laws that make it so that the reality of Vermont is as wonderful and community-driven and virtuous as the ideal they're selling it? Or are they simply going to try to paper it over and pretend it doesn't exist? And so that's the question you want to deal with as we move towards the 1930s, because George Aiken is on the way, and don't worry, he's going to fix everything. Okay? All right.